Hello, my name is Bailey and I work for the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center. And today I will be leading you through one of our new virtual field trips called Trees of Tahoe. And I am going to start my presentation. Let's dive right in. Okay, so welcome to our virtual field trip, Trees of Tahoe. During this field trip, we're gonna learn about the common trees you can find around Lake Tahoe and our forests, how to identify them, and how to determine if a forest is healthy and what exactly that means. So normally our field trips that we offer at the Science Center are actually at our Science Center in Incline Village in Nevada. Unfortunately, we can't do anything in person right now, so we have translated all of our field trips to being virtual. So rather than going into the Science Center and doing a tour of our exhibits, you get to watch this video with me and learn a little bit more about trees on this new platform. Here is our agenda for this field trip. It's broken up into two main parts. We will be learning how to identify the common trees in Tahoe, and then you get to practice your identification skills on pine cones, pine needles, or by looking at the trees in your yard or in your neighborhood. So hopefully you have those easily accessible to you. And then part two, we're going to talk about biodiversity, what that means and how it relates to forest health. And you're going to watch me go on a nature walk in the forest to collect data on forest biodiversity. And then we are going to look at that data and analyze it and try and answer the question, are Tahoe's forests healthy? And then at the end, you will learn just a little bit about what our UC Davis TERC researchers are doing in Tahoe's forests. So we like to start our field trips with a warm-up called I Notice, I Wonder, It Reminds Me Of. And it's a really good way to get your brain thinking about the topic that we're going to discuss, which is trees. And it's also a really good way to practice thinking like a scientist. So scientists make observations, they ask questions, they make connections, and that is what this warm-up is about. So we are going to start with an observation. I want you to take 1 minute to write down on a piece of paper if you're by yourself or if you have friends or family or classmates with you. You can discuss with them about what you notice about trees in Tahoe. So I want you to make some observations about what you notice. And you can make these observations based off of the photo that I provide to you on the next slide, or if you are near a window and you can see some trees outside, you can make your observations based off of those trees. You can also make your observations off of any memories that you have of being outside in a forest. And we have these blue slides throughout our presentation. So when you see these blue pause here slides, we want you to pause the video for the time indicated. And this is where you'll have time to discuss. So you can pause now and talk about your observations. Cool, so hopefully you took your minute to talk about what you notice about trees in Tahoe. I'll give you some examples of things that I noticed about trees in Tahoe. So I noticed that when you're driving down the road around the lake, you never really just see one tree. You're always seeing a lot of trees because I noticed that we live in a forest. And I noticed that our trees are really big and really tall and really green. So I noticed that we have a lot of evergreen trees in our forest. So those are just some of the things that I noticed. I am sure you all have come up with your own unique observations about trees in Tahoe. Now I want you to ask some questions. So I wonder blank about trees in Tahoe. And again, you can pause the video here and discuss for 1 moment what you wonder about trees in Tahoe. Hopefully you took another minute to discuss that or to write it down and really think about it. Some of the things that I have wondered about our trees in Tahoe is I wonder why we have so many evergreen trees. I wonder if they're really good at high elevation or if they need a lot of sunlight. I just wonder why we have these trees specifically. And finally, in our warm-up, we are going to make some connections. So we want you to take 1 minute to think about what the words healthy forest remind you of. So you can pause here for 1 minute. So that was your last 1 minute of discussion for I Notice, I Wonder, It Reminds Me Of. I hope you came up with some really cool connections that you connect the words healthy and forest to. For me, when I think about healthy, I relate it to how I feel when I feel healthy. So I am healthy when I drink a lot of water, when I eat 3 healthy meals a day. If I go outside, I feel a little bit more healthy, or workouts. Obviously, these things don't directly apply to trees, but you can still make some connections there. So trees need water, so they need to stay hydrated, just like me. And they need food, not necessarily in the form that I eat, but in the form of nutrients that they get from the soil and the sun. And they need space to grow. So those are some of the connections that I make for a healthy forest, has those components. So now we're going to take you on a little tour of the Science Center. So when you go into the Science Center, hopefully one day in the future, you'll see that we have a tree exhibit set up, which is featured in this photo and in the video that we are about to ask you to watch. And our lovely director, Heather, is going to go through the key identifying traits for the 8 most common tree species in Tahoe's forest. And while she goes through these, take a look at the pine cones or pine needles or trees that you have in your yard, if you can see them from where you're sitting, and see if you can identify what tree they are based off of the key features that Heather is talking about in this video.
Hi, I'm Heather with the UC Davis Tahoe Science Center, and I want to welcome you to our virtual science tour. Today we're going to talk about the trees of Tahoe, and I want to share with you the 8 most common trees of Lake Tahoe. Okay, so this is the sugar pine. This is the tallest of Tahoe's trees. It can be almost 200 feet tall, and it has the largest cone. You can see a couple sizes of the cones, but it does get to these quite large cones. The branches are hard to reach because the lower branches fall off of the tree, but I had found a baby sugar pine, and the thing about the sugar pines is when you see them, they look quite a bit feathery and soft, because where most pine trees have 2 or 3 needles per cluster, a sugar pine has 5, and so you can see the 5 needles. And sugar also has 5 letters, and that's an easy way to remember it. This pine is one of the more common pines now, and this is the lodgepole pine, and I can really recognize it by its bark. The bark looks like cornflakes in a way, and the branches are not as feathery as the sugar pine, and when I grab the needles, they come off in 2, and the way I remember lodgepole pine is those 2 needles make an L for lodgepole. And the lodgepole pine has these cute little cones, and those cones can also be attached right on the branch. And so you'll see the cones attached right on there. The next 2 pines of Tahoe are the Ponderosa pine and the Jeffrey pine. And the branches look incredibly similar. They'd be impossible to tell apart if you just had a branch. And the way you can tell that it is either a Jeffrey or a Ponderosa is because it has 3 needles, and they both have that long 3 needles. That one's a little bent, but you get the idea, and they're all connected together. The pine cones are a little bit different. The Ponderosa pine is slightly smaller than the Jeffrey pine cone. Not always, because you can also have smaller Jeffrey cones. But the real way is that the Jeffrey pine cone, the prickers poke in a little bit. So this is a gentle cone. I can put my hands on it without getting stuck on it. This one, you have to be really careful because these poke out. And so we say prickly Ponderosa and gentle Jeffrey. The other thing that's representative of a Ponderosa pine is that the bark, if you were to break off a piece of the bark, it breaks apart and looks like these little puzzle pieces. So I think of prickly Ponderosa and puzzle Ponderosa. Whereas the Jeffrey, with its gentle cones, this bark is a little bit darker, and if you get your nose in the tree, you can smell a delicious vanilla or butterscotch smell. And so the Gentle Jeffrey has that delicious smell. Okay, the next two trees we're going to talk about are both fir trees. And fir trees have much shorter needles. You can see that they're just about an inch or so long. And the two main firs that we have are white fir, and you see that it's flat with short needles, versus the red fir, which looks a little bit more like a toothbrush. They point up. And so these needles are short, and that's how we know that they're fir. One thing that's tricky about a young white fir is that they can sometimes start pointing up a little bit. So if you're looking at brand new growth, it can be confusing, but the main way to tell the difference is that white fir grows near lake level and red fir grows up at higher elevations. So another way to tell the difference between the white fir and the red fir is that the red fir is round and they go around the branch, where the white fir is wide. So red for round and white for wide. This beautiful tree is a cedar tree, and it is very easy to recognize because of its flat fern-like leaves and its smooth cinnamon red bark. And the bark is very obvious when you see it because it's so red and it has this very unique and distinct look to it that makes it a cedar. Okay, last but not least, this is a quaking aspen. And right now the leaves are green, but in the fall these leaves will turn yellow and fall off. This is our most common deciduous tree, so it loses its leaves for the winter. So this would be a great plant to put on the south side of your building because it would provide shade for you in the summer, but wouldn't prevent the sun from coming in the winter. And it is a quaking aspen. Thanks for joining us at the UC Davis Tahoe Science Center. We hope you'll come visit soon.
I hope you enjoyed that little YouTube video tour of our Science Center. Now we are going to put your new knowledge to the test. I'm going to show you some photos of trees, and I'm going to ask you a question and see if you can identify what tree they are. So let's dive right in. Our first question is, what type of deciduous tree is this? It can be a pine, fir, cedar, or aspen. And deciduous tree means a tree that loses its leaves in the fall and winter when it gets cold. So it does not have its leaves year round. And the way this quiz is going to work is I'm going to set a 30-second timer, and you will have 30 seconds to either discuss with your friends or siblings or parents if they are around for this field trip, or if you are by yourself, you can just write it down in a piece of paper or a notebook. And I am going to switch the slide after a few seconds and to show you these photos up close so you can get a better view. And then in the last few seconds, I'll switch it back to this same slide so that you can see the answers again. So I will set my 30-second timer and go. I hope that was enough time for you, and if it doesn't seem like it's enough time, you can pause the video during that section and take as much time as you need to look at these photos to try and determine what type of tree it is. So for this question, the answer is an aspen. So this is Tahoe's most common deciduous tree. In the spring and summer, its leaves are a nice bright green, and in the fall and winter, once the seasons start changing, the leaves turn these brilliant shades of yellow and orange. Okay, we're on to our second question, and this is going to have the same format. So I'm going to read the question out loud, and I will give you 30 seconds to view these photos, and I'll switch the slides so that you can see the photos up close. And then after 30 seconds, I will show you the answer. And I really encourage you to, again, discuss this question with your family or friends that are participating with you today. And if not, just write down your answer on a piece of paper. So, what type of evergreen tree is this? And an evergreen tree is different from a deciduous tree because it does not shed its needles or leaves in the fall and winter. It stays green all year round. So that's where it gets the evergreen name. So I will set my 30-second timer. That is time. So if you need a little bit more time, pause the video now. And if not, what type of evergreen tree is this? It is a pine tree. And the way we know that it is a pine tree is because pine trees have very distinct bunches of bundles of needles. So these needles are attached in bundles to the branch. So you can kind of see there are two needles right here attached to the branch, and all of these bundles of needles form this big bunch look, which you can see on our larger tree. So we have 4 common pine trees in the Tahoe Basin. Sugar pines are the tallest of the pine trees commonly found in Lake Tahoe, and they have the largest pine cones as well. And their pine cones can grow up to 20 centimeters long, which is significantly longer than any of the other pine cones in Tahoe. Lodgepole pine trees are identified by their bark that kind of resembles cornflakes. The Jeffrey pine and Ponderosa pine are both very similar trees. Their needles come off in bundles of 3, but the main way you can tell a difference is that if you are close enough, you can smell the Jeffrey pine, and its bark really smells very sweet. So some people say it smells like cinnamon, vanilla, or butterscotch. Ponderosa pine does not produce this sweet smell, and if you were to take off the bark and look at it, it would resemble puzzle pieces. So we'll take a look at their cones and needles. So the sugar pine, like I said, has the largest cones, and they also have needles, 5 needles per bundle. So if you take off a bundle from the tree or from the ground near the trunk of a tree, and it has 5 needles per bundle, you know it's a sugar pine. And the way I remember this is the word sugar has 5 letters, and sugar pines have 5 needles. Lodgepole pines have 2 needles per bundle, and I remember this, that when the needles, if you open it up, it can resemble an L shape, an L shape. So L for lodgepole pine. They also have the smallest cones. They're only about an inch or 2 long. Jeffrey pine and Ponderosa pine, like I said before, they're very similar trees. So if you see a pine tree that has 3 needles per bundle and you don't know whether it's a Jeffrey or a Ponderosa pine, you can pick up a pine cone off the ground near the base of the tree and hold it. And if you hold it and it does not poke you, that means it is a gentle Jeffrey cone. And the reason why it's gentle is the spines, the pokey parts, on gentle Jeffrey cones actually face in, so the spines don't face out like they do on a Ponderosa pine. So if you were to hold Ponderosa pine cone, it would poke you because those spines stick out and poke your hands. So you can remember a gentle Jeffrey and a prickly Ponderosa. Our third question, I will put my 30-second timer back on. There's our timer. So the answer to what type of evergreen tree is this? It is a fir tree. And in Tahoe, there are two types of fir tree. We have the white fir and the red fir. And for the most part, if you're anywhere near lake level and you see a fir tree, you can pretty much assume that it's going to be a white fir because red firs are almost exclusively found at higher elevations. The other way that you can tell the difference between a white fir and a red fir is the layout of the needles. So fir trees, their needles are attached directly to the branch. This brown area is the branch, and each one of those needles is attached individually. So that's what separates it from pine trees because they're not attached in bundles. And on the white fir, the needles are a lot flatter, so they come out to the side. So I like to remember that the needles are wide for white fir. And on red fir, it kind of looks like a toothbrush in the fact that they stick up and they kind of go all the way around the branch. They're still attached on there individually, but they don't lay flat. So round for red fir and wide for white fir. Our final question, what type of evergreen tree is this? Start my 30-second timer. Okay, so our final question, hopefully you got that. What type of evergreen tree is this? Is a cedar. And the key identifying features of the cedar are the red bark. And to me, the bark kind of looks almost like veins, like it's the bark goes up in vertical strips rather than being in clusters that pine trees typically have. Their leaves or needles are scaly and they are sectioned. So if you see a younger cedar tree or a sapling, which is what this tree is right here, you can actually see the leaves and needles a little bit easier because it's at a closer height to us. Whereas once you get to these big mature cedar trees, the lowest branches can be up to 50 feet high, so you can't really see the leaves that well. So younger growth is a lot easier to look at those scaly sectioned leaves, whereas older growth, the bark alone will tell you that this is a cedar tree. There are no other types of trees in the Tahoe Basin that has bark that looks quite like this. So now we want you to take a moment to share what trees you have based off of the pine needles or pine cones that you were hopefully able to bring with you on this field trip. Again, we would love it if you would discuss this with your friends or family members that are at home, or you can just take the next few minutes to puzzle out which trees you have and record them under your quiz questions. So make sure to pause the video when you do this, and then once you're ready, you can resume it and we will move on. Okay, so the importance of tree identification. Why did I just make you learn all of that? And this is a important question, but I want you to discuss why you think that tree identification might be important. So I'm gonna let you pause the video here again and discuss this for just a few minutes. So why is it important to correctly identify trees? So why is it important to correctly identify trees? There are many reasons why it's important to identify trees. I personally enjoy being able to go on a hike and walk through the forest and know what's around me. I feel like I have a better understanding of nature when I know what's around me. So I can look at a tree and tell my friends, hey guys, go smell that bark. I bet you it smells really good. And they're almost always impressed when it does, because most people don't go around sniffing tree bark. I think that it's kind of a fun fact that you can share with friends and family on hikes, but there is importance for research as well. So being able to identify what trees are in our forest gives us a way to determine whether or not our forest is healthy. And this takes us back to one of the first slides when we were making connections to what we thought a healthy forest meant, and what that means to us. So next I'm going to go through some of the main ways we can determine if a forest is healthy, and after that I'll take you on a nature walk where we can practice our tree identifying skills and collect some data to determine whether or not our forests are healthy. If you feel like you need to take a break, you can pause the video at any time. Otherwise, I am going to continue on. So, what are factors of a healthy forest? What does this mean? So the first one I want to talk a little bit about is that the majority of trees and plants are alive. And we really want to emphasize the majority in this statement. So it doesn't mean that all trees and plants have to be alive. That's not necessarily realistic because we know that all living things die. So if you're walking through a forest and you see a handful of dead trees, that is actually an indicator of a normal forest, not healthy or unhealthy. That's just the way that forests work. However, if you're walking through a forest and a majority of the trees and plants are dead, that is a telltale sign that something is going on here that is unhealthy. So this forest would be considered unhealthy. So dead trees are okay. You just want the majority of trees and plants to be alive. The next one is a diversity of age groups. And trees have age groups the same way that people do. So people, you're born as a baby, you grow up into a toddler, a child, a teenager, an adult, grandparents, you slowly get older. And trees have similar age groups based on their lifespan. So the 4 age groups that trees have are seedlings, which is new growth, so they can be sprouting just above the surface to 3 feet tall would be a seedling. A sapling is a tree that is over 3 feet tall, but it's not quite mature yet. And one way that you can identify if it's a very tall sapling or a mature tree is that it's got flexible bark, which means if you were to touch the trunk of the tree, you could kind of move it around. Whereas if I were to go outside and touch a pine tree that was fully grown, it's not going anywhere. I am not strong enough to move a pine tree, but I am strong enough to move a pine sapling. The next one is a mature tree, which are the majority of trees that you see when you look into a forest. They're big, they're obvious, they're tall, they are mature. And our last age group are dead trees. You can tell if a tree is dead if it has dried up brown needles or leaves or no leaves at all. However, it is important to take into consideration the type of tree that you are looking at. So if you're looking at a pine tree and an aspen tree in December and the pine tree has no needles or all of the needles are brown, then it's most likely dead. But if the aspen tree has no leaves, it's most likely still alive because an aspen tree is a deciduous tree, which means it loses its leaves in the fall and winter, but they'll grow back in the spring. So you want to have a diversity of age groups for a variety of reasons. One reason is that having this diversity shows that the forest is reproducing. So if there's signs of seedlings and saplings, you know that the forest is reproducing, whereas if there were only mature trees, then it's not reproducing. And if something happens to those mature trees, the forest could die off pretty quickly, because there wouldn't be a younger generation of trees to take those mature trees' place. So a diversity of age groups are important. A diversity of species. This is extremely important, and that's what we're actually going to spend the second half of this field trip talking about. So I'm not going to dedicate too much time to it on this slide. And the last thing is other types of life in the forest. So there aren't just trees in a forest, even though when we talk about forests, that's generally what we think about. But here in Tahoe, we live in forests, so people can live in forests. I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of bears this summer. Bears live in forests, birds live in forests. There is another type of life that's not a plant or an animal. It's called fungi, and those are mushrooms. That's another type of life that lives in forests. So if you are walking through a forest and you see absolutely no other type of life, that could be an indicator that the forest is not very healthy because it's not producing the nutrients or needs that other life have in order to thrive in a forest. Whereas if you're walking through and you hear the sound of birds chirping and flying through the understory, or if you see some squirrels running around chasing each other, or an occasional bear, all of these things are signs that the forest is healthy. These 4 factors are not the only things that play into forest health. Forest health is a extremely complex topic. These are just the 4 important ones that we're kind of touching on right now, but the main one is biodiversity. And I found a really great YouTube video that really explains what biodiversity is and why it's important. So I want you to pause the video here and go watch the video, What is Biodiversity? The link is in the PDF under Explain. And you only need to watch this video to minute 145. So you can pause it after that and come back here. Okay, hopefully that video was helpful to explaining what biodiversity is. So biodiversity is the amount of life, different types of life. So the way that I was just talking about the different species of trees. So biodiversity in our forest would mean having pines and firs and cedars and aspens. And I know that video does a really good job of animating and showing why high biodiversity is important for animal species, but it's also really important for tree species as well. So every tree plays a very important role in a well-functioning ecosystem, and I'm going to model that in the next few slides. So what I have here is 2 models of 2 different types of forests. One of these forests has low biodiversity, which means it only has 1 species of tree. And that is represented by these green trees, which are our firs for this model. So all of these you can think of as white fir. And over here, we have high biodiversity. So this forest has 4 species of trees. So this yellow one is an aspen. The black tree is a pine tree. This one right here is a cedar, and then we have some fir as well. So if you count, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 trees in our low biodiversity, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So we have the same amount of trees in each forest. The only difference is that one forest has 1 species and the other forest has 4 species. So we are introducing a fir engraver beetle to both of these forests. And fir engraver beetles is one of the main causes of mortality in many forests across the US. Not specifically fir engraver beetles, but what are considered bark beetles. So bark beetle is a generalization of different species of beetle that infest the bark of pine trees, and they get in there, they basically eat it all up and leave behind a forest of dead trees. And the fir engraver beetle is a specific species of bark beetle that really like fir trees. So they don't go after pines, they don't go after cedars or aspens. So what do you think is going to happen when we introduce fir engraver beetles to both of these forests? They are going to attack only the fir trees, like I just said. But what happens now? They are eating away our fir trees, so what happens next? These bark beetles eat all of the fir trees until they're gone, and then they move on to the next fir tree. So these bark beetles ate all of those firs, they've moved on, and this is the remnants of both of our forests. Our low biodiversity forest has no trees left and no species left, whereas our high biodiversity forest still has 3 species left and 7 trees. So in total, the high biodiversity forest only lost 2 trees, whereas the low biodiversity forest lost them all. So I'm hoping that this kind of highlights one of the important reasons why having high biodiversity really helps forest health. So it helps it be resilient to change, which is really important because fir engraver beetles are not the only type of bark beetle that we have here in Tahoe. Other common bark beetles we have are mountain pine beetles, Jeffrey pine beetles, and the fur engraver beetles. These beetles overall will try to infest any type of tree in the Tahoe Basin. So if we only had one type of tree, any one population of these bark beetles could wipe out all of our trees. Um, the reason why this hasn't happened is because trees actually have a way of fighting back. So if a bark beetle enters a tree, it's not game over. The tree is not doomed. The tree has the ability to use its sap. That's the sticky stuff. If you've ever sat on a tree log, touched a tree, or stepped on something and gotten that sticky residue, that is sap from a tree. And a tree can actually use its sap to push beetles out from its bark. So this process is called pitching out beetles. And it's a really effective way that they can do this. So they're really, really good at getting rid of bark beetles. However, they are not good at using their pitch to pitch out bark beetles if trees are dealing with other stressors. So if the bark beetle is the only thing that a tree has to deal with, it's going to be okay. But if it's dealing with other factors that influence forest health, such as drought, wildfires, other types of parasites, so bark beetles are considered a type of parasite, pathogens, or if they're competing too much for space and resources with other trees, then it's got just too much to deal with. It's like having work and homework and sports and friends. Like you have all this stuff in your life, and it's okay to deal with one or two of those things. But once you're dealing with it all, it can get kind of stressful. So trees can get stressed out too. So a few years ago, Tahoe had a pretty bad drought, and that caused a large mortality of trees in our Tahoe forests. And that's because trees had other things to deal with during that time of drought. They had bark beetles, there were still wildfires. So trees have a lot of things to deal with. So if they only have to deal with one of these things, trees can be very resilient. They can bounce back, they can fight them off. But having to deal with all of this at once is too stressful for trees. So this is why forest health is a very complex topic, because you can't look at trees in isolation. You can't look at one tree and say, yes, this is healthy. It's got a whole lot more going on. Now that we have gone over some of the key factors of forest health, we are going to put our new knowledge to use. In a moment, I'm going to take us on a nature walk to ID trees and collect data so we can assess the health of our forests. But first, I want to take a moment to tell you about two resources that might be helpful for you when you start practicing your tree identification skills. One of them is our student tree ID cheat sheet, which is on the PDF that you have access to. And it is just a document that has all of those identifying features written down that I just mentioned. So how many needles per bundle a sugar pine has, or a lodgepole pine. So it's just written out for each tree. The other one is this tree key provided to you by SWEP, which is the Sierra Watershed Education Partnership. And they also do environmental science in North Lake Tahoe. I'm sure if you haven't heard of them before, that you will at some point do a field trip with them if you are located in the North Tahoe area. They are great, and they made this tree key that we are using. And the way this tree key works is that it just asks you one question at a time, and it has two possible answers. And you just keep on going down the key, following the arrows until you get to the tree that you're identifying. For example, if I am standing in front of a Ponderosa pine tree and I don't know what kind of a tree it is, I can use the tree key to help me determine what type of tree it is. So I will just walk us through how to use this tree key. And over to the side, I have a photo of the tree that I'd be standing in front of. So we can imagine that this is me and I'm looking up at this tree. And our first question on the tree key is it an evergreen tree or is it a deciduous tree? And I know that this tree is an evergreen because it has the classic evergreen look, and it is green all year round. It's always going to look like this. So we know it's an evergreen. So we're going to go on to the next question below evergreen, which is, are the leaves attached individually or are they attached in bundles? And we can see in this photo of the pine needles that they are attached in bundles. You can kind of see them clustered together, and that is one bundle, and then they're attached to the branch. They are not attached on the branch individually. So we know they are attached in bundles. So we move on to the next question, which is, are the bundles of needles in groups of 2, 3, or 5? I know that these needles are in bundles of 3. It can be kind of hard to determine in this photo, so hopefully it will be a little bit easier when you're looking at it in person, but the needles that are in bundles of 2 or 5 are actually much shorter than the needles that are in bundles of 3. So that's one way that I know that this is a bundle of 3. So then we go down to our next question, which looks at the pine cones. So are the pine cones pokey or are they gentle? And this is referring to which direction the spines are facing. So the spines are the pokey parts at the edge of the pine cones, and if they're facing out, then they are pokey and they'll poke your hand. And if they're facing in, then they are gentle. You can pick it up and it won't hurt you. And it's a little bit hard to tell in this photo, but I know that these spines are actually faced outwards. So this is a pokey cone. So we know it is a pokey pine cone, which means that this is a Ponderosa pine tree. So that is how you use the tree key. When you're outside practicing your tree identification skills, this can be a really good resource for you to use. It takes a few minutes, especially the first time you're using the tree key, but the more you practice with it, the faster you will get. And if you really, really like trees and you like going on hikes and practicing often, you won't even need the tree key anymore. You'll have all of this great knowledge just stored in your brain, ready to pull out fun facts for your friends and family. Okay, it's almost time for me to head outside for our nature walk. What I'm going to do is head out into the forest for about 10 to 15 minutes, and I'm going to identify every tree I see along the side of the hiking path. And once I figure out what tree it is, I will mark it on my data sheet. That way we can analyze the data once I come back inside and we can assess the health of the forest. When scientists try to determine if a forest is healthy, they follow similar procedures, but they would mark out quadrats, which are 10 by 10 foot squares in many spots throughout the forest, and identify every tree within the square. For our nature walk, we are just going to keep it simple by walking along a path and identifying the trees that we see along the side so that you don't have to bring any extra supplies with you into the forest. All you'll need is a data sheet, which you can either print out the one that I will provide for you or write it down on a piece of paper like I do, a pen, and the tree key or tree ID sheet if you want those resources with you. So you can follow me on our nature walk. I'm going to follow the path here, and I'm just going to identify all of the trees that I see along the side of the path for about 10 to 15 minutes, and I'm going to collect a little bit of data so that we can analyze later whether or not this forest is healthy. So the data that I will be collecting is on the 4 common trees. So we are going to be looking for pine, fir, cedar, and aspen trees. And along the way, if I see that it is a ponderosa pine or sugar pine, a lodgepole pine, or Jeffrey pine, I will let you know how I know that, but we are not going to be collecting data on that today. And it's really important that when you do this on your own, you follow these same procedures so that when we analyze our data collectively, it will all be accurate. So let's go on our nature walk. So we're going to start with the 3 trees that are behind me right here. We're going to start first with this tree. So if we take a look up, we can see that this is an evergreen tree. And we know that it is an evergreen tree because it is currently December and it has all of its needles still. And if it was a deciduous tree, the needles would have been fallen off and this would be very bare. So we know it's an evergreen tree, and now we have to determine whether or not the needles are attached in bundles or individually. And since it's pretty tall and I can't reach the needles above me, I'm going to pick up some needles at the base of the tree. And I'm going to check and make sure that they look the same as the needles that are on the tree above, and they do. And I see that when I pick up these needles, they come in a bundle, so they are not attached individually. So I know that this is a pine tree. So I'm just going to mark on my data sheet that it's a pine. And these needles are attached in 3. Let's see if I can hold those up. So we know that this is either a Ponderosa pine tree or a Jeffrey pine tree. And the way to determine that is by looking at the bark or their pine cones. So there is a pine cone right here. And I know that this is a Jeffrey pine cone because the spines on the pine cone face in. So these are the pokey parts are called spines, and if they were facing out, it would be a prickly Ponderosa cone, but they're facing in, so it is a gentle Jeffrey. We have two trees over here. So this first one, it is short enough that I can actually take the pine needles right off of it, so we can determine right away what kind of a tree it is. We see that they come off in bundles, not individually, so we know that this is a pine tree. So I'm going to mark that on my data sheet. And this pine tree also has needles in bundle of 3, so again, it is a Ponderosa pine or a Jeffrey pine, but it's really hard to determine what type of a pine tree it is right now because this is actually a sapling. So it hasn't developed any cones yet. That is what a mature tree would do. And we'll look at this next tree. This one is just a little bit too tall to be able to pull off needles from it, so I'm going to have to take them from the ground. I need to make sure that they look similar to the needles above me, and they do. And again, these come off in a bundle. They're not individually attached, so we know it's a pine tree. And we'll continue on. So we've got our next 2 trees that we're going to identify here. So we'll start with this really, really big tree right here, and if I look up, I know what kind of needles I should be looking for, but I can't reach them, so I have to take them off the ground. I want to make sure they look the same, and they do. And so this is another pine tree because the needles came in a bundle. So I'm going to mark on my data sheet that it is a pine. So we know that this pine tree is either a Ponderosa pine or a Jeffrey pine because the needles come in a bundle of 3. And so the next way we can determine whether or not it's a Jeffrey or a Ponderosa is either look for the pine cones or to look at the bark. And so the bark actually produces a really sweet smell when it's a Jeffrey pine, and this tree smells pretty good. So I know it's a Jeffrey, but we are not collecting data on that. We're just collecting that it is a pine tree. And we'll continue over here. So this tree right here is another evergreen, and since its leaves are really low, I can break some off, and I will show you what they look like. So these leaves are very flat, and they are scaly and segmented, so they have individual parts that I can break off. And this is a telltale sign that this is a cedar tree. So I'm going to mark that on our data sheet. There's one other tree that we don't talk about in our Trees of Tahoe field trip, but that is a Sierra juniper, and junipers actually look very similar to cedars, except they are not flat, they're more rounded. So if you see that they're flat, you know it's a cedar tree. So these are the next 2 trees we are going to identify. So we have this evergreen right here. We know that it is an evergreen because it still has all of its leaves, even though it is winter, or almost winter. And so I'm going to grab some needles off of the ground, and I'm going to double check that they look like the needles that are on this tree, and they do, and they come together in a bundle. So we know that this is a pine tree. Mark that on the data sheet, and I can tell you what type of pine it is by looking at the pine cones. And so these spines, see if I can show this to you, the spines on the end of the pieces of the pine cone, they stick out. So this is a prickly Ponderosa cone. So this is a Ponderosa pine tree. And so right here we have a fir tree. And so we can see on the fir that these needles are attached directly to the branch right here. So if I just break off one needle, we see that it comes off individually, whereas the pine needles, they come off in a bundle. So they are attached to the branch as a bundle, whereas the fir needles are attached directly to the branch individually. So I can write down that we have a fir, and we'll continue on. So we've got some interesting trees behind me right here. We have a smaller tree nestled underneath a large cedar that looks like it's falling over, but it continues growing right past this other large pine tree. So let's investigate and figure out exactly what type of trees all of these are and why we know that. We can start with the small one because I can actually see all of its needles, and so if we look close, we can see that all of the needles here are attached directly to the branch. So if we pull it off, it comes off individually. So we know that this is a fir tree, so I'll mark that on my data sheet. And we know that this is a sapling, not a mature tree, because all of the needles are sticking straight up, and that tells you that this is a white fir sapling. So now that we know that this is a fir tree, I will tell you why I know that this is an incense cedar oak tree. So, if we look up, you can see very distinct strips of bark that go up towards the tree. And this is a telltale sign that we have a cedar right here. No pine or fir tree has similar bark, so we can write down that we have a cedar. So let's go see what this last tree is. This right here, we can see that it is an evergreen tree. It's still got all of its needles, but the needles are too high for me to pick off the tree, so I'm gonna look at the ground. And this right here looks like it came from the same tree. They're a lot shorter needles than other pine trees. And so if we pluck off some needles, I'll put this on the ground. We can see that they come in a bundle, so we know it's a pine tree. So I will mark on my data sheet that we've got a pine. And if we look at them, this pine tree has needles in bundles of 5. So we know that this pine tree is actually a sugar pine. And the way that I remember that is that there are 5 letters in the word sugar, and there are 5 needles in a sugar pine bundle of needles. And I will see if my lovely videographer can get some shots of the giant pine cones that will be hanging off, because sugar pines have the largest pine cones of any pine tree here in Lake Tahoe. So we can see these giant pine cones hanging off the top of our sugar pine tree. So here we have another evergreen tree, because it still has all of its green needles, even though it's really cold outside. And I am going to just take a few off, and I will come show them to you. So we see that all of these needles are attached directly to the branch. If I pick off a needle, it comes off individually. So we know that this is a fir tree. And we know that this is a white fir, not a red fir, because all of the needles are very wide. They go out to the sides from the branch, whereas the red fir, they kind of stick up and down, and they go all the way around. So remember, wide for white fir. I'll mark that on my data sheet, and we will continue. So we have another evergreen tree right here, and this is another fir. So if I pluck off a needle, it comes off individually. It does not come in a bundle, and so I am going to record that we have a fir tree. And another way that you can determine whether or not a fir is a red fir or a white fir is just based off of where you're seeing the fir. So I know that right now I'm pretty close to lake level, so more likely than not this is going to be a white fir, because white fir are found at lake level and red fir are almost always found at higher elevations. So we know that this is a white fir, and we can also tell because the needles on it are out to the side, so they're very wide, they're not round. So this is the last tree that I am going to identify, because we've been out here for about 10 to 15 minutes now, so I'm going to head back inside, and we are going to analyze this data and see if we can answer the question, are Tahoe's forests healthy?
Here we are in the Quaking Aspen grove, and you can hear the sound of the leaves quaking, and you can recognize the bark that looks quite white.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the nature walk. I have already inputted the data into my PowerPoint presentation for us to look at together. So based off of my data collection sheet, we found 0 aspen, 6 pines, 4 firs, and 2 cedars. So those are some pretty nice looking numbers once I put them onto my graph. So we have number of trees on this axis and types of trees down here. So 0 aspen, 6 pine, 4 fir, and 2 cedar. So I want you to take about 15 seconds just to look at this graph and kind of think about what it means in respect to what we just discussed. Okay, we are going to have a discussion. So for the next few questions, I want you to, again, if you're alone, I want you to think about this and write it down on a piece of paper or in your journal, or if you are with other friends or classmates or parents, you can have a discussion with them. And I want you to spend about 3 to 5 minutes per question. So you can pause the video here and talk about, do you think forest biodiversity is high or low? So this question is not always straightforward. It's a little bit subjective, which means that it could really go either way. So when I'm looking at this, I think that it shows that the forest biodiversity is high because you have 3 out of the 4 species of trees and you have a variety of amounts of each type of tree. Whereas if you were to have walked into the forest and only seen pine trees and nothing else, I think that would have been an indicator of low forest biodiversity. Having all 3 types of trees is an indicator of high forest biodiversity. It's kind of a toss-up if you were to walk into the forest and only see 2 species of trees. That's where it kind of can go either way, and you have to look at some of those other factors. So did you see other life? Did you see saplings and seedlings mixed in with mature trees? Were there a majority of dead trees? So that's where this kind of gets a little bit complex. Because there's more than just biodiversity to think about, but for the purposes of this field trip, I really do want you to focus on biodiversity. So I would consider that this shows that forest biodiversity is high. Our next question that I want you to discuss about, again, for 3 to 5 minutes is, what can we conclude based on the data we just collected? I want you to pause the video here for 3 to 5 minutes and have that discussion with your friends or family. So based off of just the data we collected on biodiversity, like I said in the last discussion question, that I believe that this shows that Tahoe has high forest biodiversity, which is an indicator of a healthy forest. If it was low biodiversity, then that would be an indicator of an unhealthy forest. And I want you to take another 3 to 5 minutes and pause this video here to discuss this final question. So, can we make conclusions about Tahoe's forest based on this area we surveyed? The answer is no. So I could have walked through the one section of forest that had high biodiversity, or I could have walked through the one part of the forest that didn't have any aspen trees. You can't base an entire forest's health off of one area. So while this gives us an insight, it gives us the ability to look and start assessing forest health. You can't assess it in one geographical location in the forest. When you go do this on your own in the post activity, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, I want you to consider surveying multiple sections of the forest rather than just one section like I did. The more areas that you survey, the more accurate your data will be when you're trying to answer the question, are Tahoe's forests healthy? We want you to do this activity and data collection to get you to practice your tree identifying skills, practice assessing forest health, and to start critically thinking about the forests in Lake Tahoe. So the big question that I'm going to end this field trip on, are Tahoe's forests healthy? And again, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to discuss or write down your answer. Hopefully that was enough time. I kind of gave away the answer to that in my last little spiel, but it is complicated. Forest health is always complicated. But the more people that understand forest health, maybe the easier it is to start addressing this question and looking for it. When you go outside and go on hikes, we have a huge privilege of living in such a beautiful forest here in Lake Tahoe. So I really hope you utilize this new knowledge when you go out and you can appreciate the forests in a slightly different way. There's one final piece that I'm going to have someone else explain for me. My coworker Allison is going to explain what the UC Davis Tahoe environmental researchers are doing to try and make Tahoe's forests healthier.
So the UC Davis Forest and Ecology Lab uses ecological and genetic approaches to promote forest health and resiliency. So they're looking at things like plant traits, as well as the influence of the surrounding environment and the resulting evolutionary processes. So what does that all mean? To really set this up, you need to think about how we get our characteristics. In the same way that you may have inherited your mom's green eyes, or perhaps you've inherited your dad's tall stature, his height. Plants can also pass on traits similar to their progeny or their baby trees. So we are targeting trees that display these adaptive traits that are necessary for survival, in hopes that our selected trees are better able to withstand the many challenges of our currently changing climate and the related impacts. And this is just one solution to confront the large loss of sugar pines. We reforest stands with trees specifically selected due to their proven resilience against bark beetle outbreaks. So basically, in a stand of dead trees, we're looking for the ones that are still standing. We're looking for the survivors. So, September 2017, TERC's Forest and Ecology Lab collected from a diverse seed source across the north shore of Lake Tahoe. And these seeds were germinated, and some seedlings were planted in the basin, and others currently reside in our lath house in the Tahoe City Field Station, where they are being monitored and evaluated for their selected plant traits. The thousands of seedlings that were planted around the Tahoe Basin will theoretically promote forest resiliency, because these baby trees are the progeny of drought survivors and are more likely to persist in our changing and uncertain climate. Darwin's theory summarizes it best. Everybody's heard of survival of the fittest. In this case, the strongest trees have survived, and the key to their survival is in their genes. So thanks so much for joining me, and hopefully I'll see you around the healthy forests.
So I hope that gave you an understanding of what our researchers are doing. And this is the end of our field trip, so I really hope you enjoyed and learned something new during this. We have a few follow-up activities because we don't want this to be the end of your tree identification skills. We want you to keep practicing them. So we've created a game of Tahoe Tree Bingo, which is a combination of a scavenger hunt and a bingo game. And those bingo cards are accessible in the PDF as well. There are 4 cards, so if you want to play against your family or friends, you can print them out or you can use them on a phone or an iPad. You just have to walk into the woods and identify some trees. And then the other one is assessing the health of forests in your backyard or neighborhood. So this one, I am personally going to challenge you at home to do what I just did today. If you have the ability to print out my data sheet and my whole activity, if you don't have a printer, you can write it down by hand. That's what I have to do because I don't have a printer at home. You will go out for 15 minutes, identify as many trees as you can in those 15 minutes, and write them down, which ones you see. You can do a tally, and then make a graph and assess the health of your forests in your neighborhood around you. And hopefully, if everybody in your class does this, you will survey multiple different areas, and that can actually give you a better understanding of forest health in Lake Tahoe. So I hope you all work together and collaborate and practice your new tree identification skills. If you have any questions or you need help with any of these activities, you can always come back and refer to this video. And if you have any questions about anything I maybe didn't address or something that you thought of that you really wanted to share, you can send me an email. My email is bngoodwin@ucdavis.edu. So thank you for joining me on this virtual field trip. I hope you enjoyed.